Jesse Koppel. Here. Charlie Campbell.
Here.
Ryan Green.
Here.
Walter Robb.
Here.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Usually up there, so I know.
Do we have any public comment for matters not on the agenda? Seeing none, we will close public comment. We'll move to the approval of the minutes from January 25th, 2022.
Motion to approve as is.
Was that Charlie? Second?
Yes.
Sorry. All right. Charlie Campbell.
Yes.
Walter Robb.
Yes.
Jesse Koppel.
Yes.
John Merriman.
Yes.
Ryan Green.
Yes.
Thank you.
We'll move to our work session, which we're going to lead us to.
Excellent. Well, first of all, for those of you who I've not met, I'm Yaz Ashrawi. I'm the law director for the city of Johnstown, so look forward to working with you all. And thank you very much for allowing me to squeeze in this 5-hour training here this evening. I knew we were running short on time. I'm obviously kidding. I'm going to make this short and painless, and some of you have probably already heard a lot of these a lot of the items I'm going to go over for some of the new council members and board and commission members. It's good to hear this stuff. This is going to be a fairly high-level review, so I encourage you to ask questions today if something pops up, or contact me anytime in the future if you have additional questions, comments, concerns. And as always, the more dialogue, the more questions, the easier this is for me, so I encourage that. So we're really going to cover just a kind of a handful of topics. The powers, duties, and authority for each of the 3 public bodies that are here, Council, P&Z, and the Design Review Board. Go over, can everyone hear me okay, by the way? Yeah, okay. We're going to go over sort of the administrative versus legislative dichotomy and the manner in which each of the boards act officially. And then open meetings, public records, which I'm sure all of you have heard of, and then briefly touch on some ethics concerns. So Johnstown is governed as a city by the Ohio Constitution and the Home Rule provision in the Ohio Constitution, which essentially was drafted to give local control and local governance authority to local jurisdictions. Anything that affects this municipality, city of Johnstown, uniquely or independently from out the land and the area outside the jurisdiction, should come under Johnstown's control. The Ohio Supreme Court has, over the years, kind of peeled some of those local controls back slowly, but at the end of the day, this city has the right to govern itself as it sees fit, and that's memorialized in the city's charter, which is the governing document for the city. So, for the city council is governed, as I mentioned, by the Ohio Constitution, the Ohio Revised Code. There's an entire Title VII, that deals with municipal corporations, the city's charter, the city's codified ordinances, and then there's also rules of council that govern day-to-day meetings and procedures. The Planning and Zoning Commission is a little bit different. The Planning and Zoning Commission is referenced in the charter, so there's some governance in the charter, but it's primarily governed by the rules, policies, and procedures outlined in the codified ordinances, which can be changed from time to time by the city council. And there's a good example of that we can discuss here shortly. And then obviously council, who ultimately has the discretion to set policies and procedures for the various boards and commissions, create new boards and commissions as they see fit, and set set procedures for those boards. And then the Design Review Board is primarily, it is not referenced in the charter, so it's primarily governed by the codified ordinances in the city's ordinances, and then as, by council, as council sees fit to change those policies and procedures. Is this riveting? Any questions so far? I mean, I know this is super exciting, so. This is the first time being able to talk to 3 separate bodies all at once, and so I think this portion of the training is the most interesting to me, at least, and that is the manner in which each of the bodies act in different times. So, local governments take formal action through motions, resolutions, and ordinances. Typically, ordinances are used by the legislative authority of the city council, for things that are of permanent nature, that need to be documented or maintained for financial auditing, or for a change in law that needs to be codified. Resolutions are typically used by the legislative body for things that are of temporary nature, are of overarching policies or procedures, things that are not being codified, things that are not permanent in nature. And then motions are sort of the least formal way to act that all bodies use for various things, whether it's as simple as approving the minutes or appointing various members to different bodies. So those are that's the hierarchy of how you take action. Local government bodies can act in a legislative capacity, or they can act in administrative capacity. In this room, there's only one body, according to the Johnstown Charter and codified ordinances, that can act in a legislative capacity, and that is the city council. When I refer to acting in a legislative capacity and administrative capacity, I'm gonna do what they did in law school to us. Can anyone tell me what that means? Can anyone tell me the difference? Oh, yeah. Oh, now he's paying attention. The question was, when I say that council can act in a legislative capacity or an administrative capacity, can anyone tell me the difference between those two? Correct. But what's the difference? You guys didn't know this, but there's a point system, and I've got a tremendous prize at the end of it. And Marvin just got the first points of the game. That's right, Marvin. So, yeah, game's rigged. I gave him all the questions. Yeah. So when council and council only acts in a legislative capacity, they are passing new laws. They're formulating laws or policy. The way I like to think about it is, if council is doing something that affects the residents or the city as a whole, they are acting in a legislative capacity. The easy one is creating a new law. When council does act in a legislative capacity, the public is certainly permitted and oftentimes encouraged to participate, but that is not a public hearing. The term hearing denotes, as I think the P&Z members can attest, because we've had this training before, that is sort of a judicial proceeding with evidence and testimony. But public hearing in the sense of a legislative capacity is people getting up there like they do at the State House, like they do at the federal level, to express opinions, to be proponents of a law that's going to be passed, to be opponents of a law that's going to be passed. And the public is free to do that. Council is free to regulate the time, manner, and place which that happens. But that's not done under oath. That's not done in any formal capacity. It is simply opinions being stated by the public based on a policy or a law that's being contemplated by council. When council or the other boards act in an administrative capacity, you are administering the laws. So this typically affects one applicant, for example, or one landowner, or somebody that is asking the city to apply the laws to them, to apply the laws to the application they seek, or for example, an example of a variance to set some of those laws aside to allow them to do what they want to do. Council acts in can act in administrative capacity. Planning and zoning and the design review board exclusively operate in administrative capacity. And so anytime you have an administrative hearing, what you're doing is you're applying the facts of whatever you're dealing with to the law as it's stated. I'm gonna go back to P&Z because they have some good examples, right? So P&Z hears variances, requests for conditional use permits, and things of that nature. And the standards for those requests are outlined, are set. They are laws created by the city, and then you apply those facts in the application. You apply the testimony you hear at those hearings to those standards, and your decision-making is based on that. Just like the Design Review Board will hear applicants for certificate of appropriateness based on the standards that are outlined. Any questions so far? Yes, thank you, Jesse.
So, Kevin, since the design review board's sort of new, I'm still a little unclear on how the process would go. For example, tonight we had Ace Hardware come in. He wants to get, we have a standard of 100 square foot frontage, right? For example, if the design review board wants to give him an exception to that, I don't know if we have a term for that exception. I don't think it would necessarily be a variance. So the design review board can still give them a certificate of appropriateness, I would imagine, even, based on what their opinions are. Some of the rules overlap though, so it might also be in the zoning code, which then, so it's kind of like, so then now, if it was in the zoning code also, then it would have to come to us to a variance after the appropriation, and then go to council after that, because all variances go to them for final approval, I believe, so it's like, stuff like that would go.
I think planning and zoning has the final say on variances. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Yeah, so good question. The Design Review Board was new to me too. In fact, I think Teresa and I exchanged some emails like, wait a second, when was this created? The Design Review Board is governed by Chapter 1187, and I had an opportunity to review that before this meeting. So the way that, in your example, you are correct. If the Ace Hardware, for example, was in one of the design review districts, they would need to apply for a certificate of appropriateness with the Design Review Board, who reviews those plans under the criteria that's established in this chapter to determine whether or not, for example, that the building material is appropriate for the area, that the dimensions of the site fit the plan in these districts, and ultimately either grant the certificate of appropriateness, grant it with conditions, or reject it. You are correct, however, that if there are other development standards or zoning requirements that ACE would need to seek variances for, those variance applications would still go to the Planning and Zoning Committee for consideration under the variance standards. There is some overlap there.
They would have final say if there's no overlap. They would have to approve and the variance come to us if they.
Correct. Yes. And
What's their recourse? If I go to the design group and they turn me down, and yet I can't come to zoning because it's not in zoning's purview, then how do I fight, or call what you want, the design committee?
there is an appeal section for that. And the
It's an appeal.
correct. The appeal actually comes to Planning and Zoning from the Design Review Board. There is, that is actually included in 1187.13. So what that says is any applicant that is aggrieved by the decision of the Design Review Board has an opportunity to appeal that decision to the Planning and Zoning Committee.
But it won't be a variance, it'll be a.
Correct, yes. The two separate proceedings, although for all intents and purposes, your process is the same. You are going to hear evidence, you're going to hear facts, you're going to have witnesses sworn in, you're going to make decisions based on the criteria for, whether it's an appeal, the criteria for the appeal, and the underlying criteria that the design review board had to follow, or if it's a variance, the criteria for the variance.
If we deal on the appeal, so we actually override the design committee in the very end. I mean, that's what you're saying, correct?
Correct. Yeah, yes. So you can either affirm the decision of the design review board, which means you would agree with them. If the applicant still if the applicant is still aggrieved after that, the appeal from the Planning and Zoning Commission actually goes to the Court of Common Pleas, the Licking County Court of Common Pleas. If your decision is to reverse the decision of the design review board, you would essentially enter a decision saying, we disagree with the design review board, and here's why, and here's the decision that we're entering on behalf of the design review board.
I got a
Perfect.
sub question. So the design review board has standards, right, that are supposed to be like the 7 guidelines that are supposed to be more flexible.
Correct.
So on the zoning code, if you wanted to take a variance from the code, you would get apply for a variance, right? Does the design review board have the ability to approve a plan that doesn't meet a standard?
Approve a plan that does,
Chase Hardware, for example, come back to it.
yeah.
It says we have a max frontage of 100 feet as a standard in the design review board. This guy wants a little bit bigger. What if I think, okay, it's a reasonable plan, but the standard says 100. Is there flexibility for them to give a certificate of appropriate?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. My suggestion on how to deal with issues like that, and I suspect these will be before the design review board frequently, is the design review board can conditionally grant a certificate of appropriateness. So grant with conditions. The condition being, we grant the certificate of appropriateness conditioned on getting approval for the variance for the setback or the frontage or the building height from the Planning and Zoning Commission.
And
Yes.
yes, I've got a question too, because it is sort of confusing, the difference between the design and the P and Z. So a lot of the meeting this evening was about the square footage of the building. Does that fall under P and Z? Where does that fall?
Well, it depends. If there is a prescribed limit to square footage and they're looking to have a larger square footage, that would fall under likely both, but definitely planning and zoning, because they would need a variance for that. The way I see a design review board generally is, if you go back and read the purpose of this chapter, this is more of the architectural, aesthetic, design features of these districts. The design review board, I'm trying to find a informal way to say it. They're more on the look, design, the non-technical aspects of development, colors, roof, right? You know,
Argue though that the square footage of the building is
absolutely.
architectural, because, I mean, it's a large building inside of
And that's why I said both, but definitely the planning and zoning. So yeah, that goes into the aesthetics. If it's too large for the lot and makes that district, makes that particular property sort of stick out in this district, or isn't consistent with the scope or intent of the district's design and look, certainly that would be into consideration. And I could argue anything. Just, yeah. So. Thanks, guys. More questions than I've had in a while. Yeah, keep them coming.
So with the certificate of appropriateness, if the design review board proves that there's no other variances, then that's sufficient and it doesn't need to go any further?
Well, the certificate of appropriateness certainly is the first hurdle for a development in those districts. I believe, and I'm going to ask Jim to correct me if I'm wrong, that a development plan would still need to come to planning and zoning to ensure that the technical aspects of that are met. Is that right? Or if they're met, it stays here?
If the COA is approved with no conditions, then at that point in time.
They're good to go.
The zoning certificate would be
Oh,
issued.
okay, I stand corrected. So for those districts, correct, so long as all the other technical zoning and development standards are met, the certificate of appropriateness would be issued, and a zoning certificate would thereafter be issued.
It would not come to you.
Correct. Well, part of their review process is to ensure that for these districts. Correct. Yeah, we're gonna get to PUDs. Yeah. Yeah, PUDs will, does that answer your question, Jesse? Probably not. So, and again, I'm gonna, because this is a fairly new board, I'm gonna ask staff to make sure I don't say anything incorrect, but these districts are specifically delineated. So this does not, my understanding, cover the entire city, correct? These are separate districts.
Correct.
Yeah.
No, they're enforcing the design.
Yeah, they're enforcing the design. I mean, certainly,
If it's already zoned though, if it's zoned UR1 and they come to build something, it goes to them. 'Cause we've already decided the zoning.
so let me give you an example. Let's think of a practical example. You've got a UR1 development or UR1 parcel, and you've got a development that if it was brought to you, you look at the height, meets the height, look at the setbacks, meets the setbacks. You look at the area, lot coverage, meets lot coverage, meets all these things. You have no choice but to sign off on it. So what the design review board is there to do is make sure whatever that building is looks pretty or looks right in that district. Because otherwise, the Planning and Zoning Commission doesn't have the right to do that. You can't say, yeah, your height's good, your lot coverage is good, your setbacks are good, but we really hate this color, or this doesn't really match with what we're trying to do in this area. Right, correct, yeah. So, yeah, no, I know you guys never do that. So it's now the Design Review Board has authority to do that. And so that's just an added layer to maintain those districts in the manner that they're meant to be maintained from an aesthetic perspective. Does that make sense? All right. You guys want to just skip to PUDs right now? Was that another question, Doug? Did I see the? Okay. So I don't know if there was a specific question about PUDs, but I'll just give everyone an overview. So for those of you who don't know what a PUD is, it is a planned unit development. It also can be referred to as a PD, a planned development, or a PDD, planned development district. A lot of acronyms. All it means is that a particular area, typically a larger area or a large single parcel or a collection of parcels that are going to make up one development, is going to have its own zoning district and own development standards. So if you look at the city's zoning code, it's got a UR1 district, it's got an R residential district, it's got an industrial district, it's got a commercial district, and those are all applied to those properties equally. You know, you got your permitted uses, you have your setback requirements, and it's a good fallback. Those are what we refer to as the straight zoning districts. When you have a new development that may not fit neatly into any one of those, or that you want to be sure is tailored specifically to what the city wants to see there, what happens is it gets rezoned, or those parcels get rezoned with a special text written only for that parcel and a specific development plan drafted only for that parcel or those parcels. So it's its own little zoning district. PUDs are a legislative function. because they are rezoning. You are changing the zoning of a parcel or parcels, which means council has the authority to do it. But PUDs do come before the Planning and Zoning Commission for recommendation. So what is first filed that is considered by the Planning and Zoning Commission is a preliminary development plan, which includes some of the zoning text and a preliminary development plan. So something that and the PUD chapter lays out precisely what the preliminary plan versus the final plan needs to contain. And so long as that plan contains those items, that first and foremost goes before the Planning and Zoning Commission for a recommendation of approval, a recommendation of rejection, or a recommendation of approval with conditions to council. If that happens, let's assume that the Planning and Zoning Commission has a recommended approval. It then goes to the City Council to either approve or reject. So the City Council gets the ultimate say on PUDs or PDDs. Once that is, let's assume that's approved. So once the preliminary development plan is approved by City Council, that approval acts as a rezoning. So now the parcel is officially rezoned for whatever that specific text says and whatever that development plan says. There's another step, though. The developer or the landowner has to come back and file a final development plan. That part is administrative, and that part is handled by the Planning and Zoning Commission. So the final development plan essentially is a beefed up, more detailed plan that is consistent with what was already reviewed and approved. There are some additional requirements in terms of detail, and ultimately, so long as that final development plan is consistent with what was previously approved, which it typically is, there should be, or there is a consideration and approval or rejection by this body. Were there specific questions about PUDs? And the reason I was going to mention, I mentioned early on the PUDs are a good example of something. The City Council recently changed the PUD process to bring it sort of more in line with practices that are fairly consistent around Central Ohio in terms of the process of the recommendation, City Council's final action, and then the return to the Planning and Zoning Commission for consideration of the final development plan. And I assure you, if there is a PUD that's coming before you that's of any significance, I may get involved to help with that process. Yeah. What's that? Yeah, well, that's a different story. Good memory. Any questions on that before I move on to open meetings? No? Great. All right. So you probably all know that in Ohio, you're required to take formal action and conduct formal business only in open meetings. And I'm sure you all know the statutory definition of a meeting, right? Marvin, you want to go 2 for 2? Do you know the definition of a meeting? I just deducted points from Marvin, so he's in last place right now. No. Yeah, negative points, no. So a meeting is any prearranged meeting, any prearranged discussion of public business that involves a majority of a public body. So I'm going to pick on the 3 that I already know. So if Jesse, John, and Ryan decide to go grab a beer after this to talk about a development, which I'm sure never happens, and they are discussing that, that is technically a public meeting. What's the problem with that? My guess is Ryan or John or Jesse or Teresa didn't advertise the local bar as the public meeting place for the Planning and Zoning Commission. There you go. Yeah. If it's just two of them, it's perfectly okay. Correct. It is a majority. And you know, this gets, the smaller the body, the trickier it gets, right? So township trustees usually have 3 people, and all of a sudden 2 people make a quorum. So, you know, again, a couple of important aspects of that definition. Prearranged, right? I'm sure, you know, a lot of folks are friends or run into each other outside of City Hall. If 3 of you happen to be at church or at the grocery store, or a majority happen to be, and you run into each other, and you say, "Boy, can you believe how long our agenda is going to be, you know, upcoming, and I don't know about this." I wouldn't recommend that, but it certainly wasn't prearranged. If you run into each other and you don't talk about public business, no harm, no foul. So keep that in mind. The reason that's important, I said one item already, and that is the notice requirements that you have to have. Just like all regular meetings are noticed, all special meetings are noticed. Teresa's got to take care of that. There's also a requirement to have minutes for any meeting. So again, back to my example, my guess is John is not taking sufficient minutes to meet the Ohio Revised Code requirement for that at the bar. But I don't know. I could be wrong. That's right. Yeah.
Question,
Yes.
how much notice do you have to give?
That's a good question. Let's see. For special meetings, it's 24 hours. Is that right? Is it?
don't think there's actually a requirement.
Okay. Best practices says that, yeah, for special meetings, it's at least 24 hours. Yeah. You got to do it. Yeah. So for special meetings, it's as soon as reasonably practical. There's an exception, obviously, if there's a catastrophic emergency, someone can call a meeting immediately. You know, it's all part of the reasonableness. For regular meetings, I think it's a couple days or a week.
If we go by our council rules,
Yeah.
which the planning and zoning rules are the same, it says that the agenda shall be posted and delivered by like 4 o'clock the Friday
before.
the meeting, which I know you guys have had question about, can that be done sooner so you have more time to review, but right now, that's what it says.
Yeah.
The 24-hour requirement, I think, is only for executive session.
That makes sense. So that is in the council rules, not in the codified ordinances. And I know a lot of jurisdictions differ. Some have requirements, less requirements. I know one of our jurisdictions sends them out 1 business day in advance. Others send them out a week in advance. So that reasonable notice is what the law requires, and then whatever the local government determines is reasonable, they get to pick. Yeah. Yes.
Okay, after our council meeting, 5 of us go out and get something to eat.
Yeah.
That's okay.
Yeah. As long as you're not conducting public business.
We're not, we
Correct.
discuss it.
Yeah. I wouldn't do that. Yeah. So. Yeah. Absolutely. That. Yeah. So. Yeah. So I would not recommend any gathering of a quorum of the public body where business is discussed. Public business is discussed. Correct. Yeah. So another example I'll give. So the courts have held that information gathering sessions, is what I like to refer to them, are appropriate to have in private. So some of the council members may recall there were times where we would get together to discuss potential development, and the developer or their representative wanted to provide just some information to council. There wasn't going to be any discussion about process or permitting or anything like that. They wanted to provide information. As long as that is truly an information gathering session as opposed to, public discussion about public business, courts have held that to be appropriate. That's one you want to be very careful with, but that's certainly appropriate. This, yeah.
It's probably more of a lobbying provision.
Correct, yeah. No. Yeah, the information gathering piece of it takes it out of that definition of a meeting because it's not a discussion. Correct. Yeah, no minutes, yeah. Again, that's one that could fall in that gray area because we all know that information gathering can easily turn into public discourse, and so you got to be very careful with that. So I don't necessarily make that a habit, but there are times when it's called for. Yeah.
Teresa said that executive.
She's right. Whatever she says, she's right.
Hey, accuracy, I agree
Yeah.
with you. About executive session, takes a 24-hour notice. Now, so that means if we had a meeting going on, something was going on, we couldn't fall back and say executive session and try to just resolve it.
Well, yeah, any public body can go into executive session. So if something occurs within the meeting, remember, it's 24 hours set by the rules, but as I mentioned, or as soon as reasonably practicable if it needs to be done immediately. So, yeah, there have been instances where there was one of our jurisdictions long ago had a very high profile in the newspaper termination that needed to happen immediately. We gave like 30-minute notice, 30 minutes worth of notice because that's all we had because the body needed to meet to discuss the termination of a public employee. So yeah, 24 hours or as soon as reasonably practical. Yeah.
If somebody provides an application for zoning's approval and things, and it's a week or two before the meeting, when are we able to view that information as a body, or as individually as a body?
As soon as you, yes, yeah, you're permitted to review an application I think as soon as it gets, the staff acts as sort of a gatekeeping to make sure this is a complete application that actually gets to you all. And by you all, I mean each of the bodies. Short of that, you can review it, as soon as you want. Now, there are, Jesse mentioned, there are some codified requirements in terms of when an applicant needs to submit an application in advance for consideration. Certificate of appropriateness in the one I'm thinking of was at least a week in advance for a revised plat, for example, needs to be at least a week in advance, and there are other little requirements like that. But as soon as it's submitted, it becomes a public record. So yeah, there's certainly, let me say this, there's certainly no harm in you as a public official, as a public body, reviewing things that have been submitted that are going to come before you for consideration. But remember that your decision-making should be based on what you hear, the testimony that you hear the day of the consideration, along with the information in the application. So I would certainly discourage any discussion amongst yourselves, prior to the actual consideration in a group setting.
If it was just for like review of information in a group setting, would that be?
Yeah, that'd be fine.
Yeah, sometimes it's, a little complicated as far as the length.
Sure, you want some more time to.
Like some time to review.
Yeah.
So just, work full-time, so sometimes the weekend's a little tough to.
Yeah.
get them all happen.
Absolutely. Yes, Ben.
Since you touched on executive session, for those that don't know, would you mind just hitting those ORC
Yeah.
specifics that are,
Yeah.
have to be met to
What a great segue. That's where I was going next. You read my mind. There are 8 of them. I'm going to assign 1,000 points for each one anyone can get. Can you tell me the 8 separate reasons you can go into executive session? Start shouting them out. What about an employee? I'll give you that. Yeah, that's the same one. Personnel is one of them. I'll get into that here in a little bit.
Potential lawsuit.
Pending or imminent litigation. I got an interesting tidbit on that, an interesting tidbit on that. Anyone else? Those are the two I think that are mostly used. There are probably 4 that will never be used by a city, any city body. So since you guys give up, I'll just go into the. That's being considered at the State House right now, but yeah. So purchasing of property, real estate. So the theory behind that is whenever a public entity becomes the buyer of a piece of property, the price all of a sudden goes up. So those discussions are subject to executive session. Negotiations or bargaining sessions with public employees, that's actually a separate one than the one we discussed earlier, which involves there's a laundry list: appointment, employment, termination, salary adjustments of a public employee. And a note on that, and I think Teresa knows this, whenever you do go into executive session under that personnel exception, it is not enough to say executive session for personnel issues. You have to say what those personnel issues are. Executive session to discuss the termination of an employee. Executive session to discuss the promotion or demotion of an employee. So it needs to be a little bit more specific than that. When you go into with the pending or imminent litigation executive session piece, it is not so that you all can go discuss amongst yourselves pending or imminent litigation. It requires a conference with an attorney about pending or imminent litigation. So there needs to be an attorney present, preferably me, but I just want to give that because, for example, if I'm not at a planning and zoning commission meeting and an applicant gets denied or rejected, and that applicant says, well, I'm going to sue you all, you then cannot enter into executive session to begin discussing pending or imminent litigation. If I happen to be here, we could do that because you're entering into a conference with an attorney to discuss that. No. So executive session, just to back up a little bit, executive session in the 8 exceptions that I'm talking about are exceptions from public meetings. So you actually go and deliberate in private about public things, about these 8 public things. So, for example, if council was having a meeting, you'll see an agenda item typically at the end or at the very beginning, and it will say executive session to discuss to conference with an attorney for pending or imminent litigation. We'll actually kick everyone out, or counsel and the attorney will go to a separate room. And it's a private deliberation discussion only among those who are invited. Now, the body can invite anyone they want to the executive session. But you need to be careful with who you invite for which executive sessions. The purpose of discussing the promotion or demotion of an employee in private would be defeated if you invite that person in with you, for example, unless you want to interview that person. So there are flexibility, but you can invite people into executive session with you, and I'll get to a point on that here in a second. So I covered the negotiations or bargaining. Matters that are required to be kept confidential by federal law, state law, or any other regulations. I, for the life of me, cannot come up with any situation that I've been involved in that's fallen under here. But I imagine if there was any reason to discuss, for example, somebody's health records, which fall under HIPAA, that would need to be kept confidential. If anyone has any better examples, I'm all ears, but I can't think of any. So these are some that apply like to school districts a lot. Details related to the security arrangements and emergency response protocol for a public body. If, for example, City Hall was being renovated and there were security cameras put in place, or we were discussing security cameras or emergency protocol if anything were to happen, where those would be located and what the, emergency procedures would be if anything were to ever happen here at a public meeting. That would fall under that exception. I think school boards more regularly enter into executive sessions about these related to, potential issues at schools and school board meetings. One of the exceptions is just to discuss public hospitals. And I'm not sure what that seems like a fantastic lobbying effort by the hospital administration, hospital association, but aside from that, I don't know. And then the last one is economic development. The provisions for economic development are actually fairly specific. They refer to discuss an application or information about a specific economic development incentive. The reason for this is, if the city is trying to attract a commercial office user to the city, and possibly there are some incentives that go with that don't, that the city doesn't want to be made public, that is, economic development efforts can be discussed in private in executive session. Couple side notes on executive session. Number one, you have to enter you have to have a majority vote to enter into executive session, and it has to be done by roll. It has to be done by calling the roll. So you can't take a voice vote to do that. You are not permitted to discuss any non-executive session matters in executive session, regardless how intertwined they are. My guess is that provision is violated pretty consistently because bodies get off on tangents and whatnot, and so kind of it's important for you all, if I am not there, to sort of police yourselves to ensure that you stay on topic, because there have been recent cases where public bodies have been hit with sanctions or violations of the Open Meetings Act because they strayed away from executive session discussions. Somebody became aware of it, filed suit. Good question. You can do it either way. I've seen communities say, we're going to executive session under 121.22G1 to discuss the promotion of an employee, and then after that, we'll continue our discussion under G4 to discuss litigation, pending or imminent litigation. Or you can go in and come out and then go in just to bifurcate, but that's not necessary. Good questions. So if you are a public official, you have an ethical obligation to keep anything that is said in executive session confidential and privileged. And it is a first-degree misdemeanor if you reveal anything confidential or privileged that was heard or discussed in executive session. That same confidentiality provision does not apply to non-public officials. So be mindful who you ask to join you. That provision doesn't apply to me, for example. No, I'm kidding. No, but if you, there are instances where a private citizen or a contract consultant or people that are not public employees or officials need to be invited in or may be invited in, so just be cognizant of that. It should be kept confidential, especially if you're having discussions with an attorney for pending or imminent litigation. That correspondence is also attorney-client privileged, so the disclosure of that could have greater ramifications than just violations of the Ohio ethics laws. Any questions so far? So violations of executive session could have monetary fines. Courts could force the public body to essentially redo anything that they discussed and improperly discussed in private in public. any decisions that were made, any motions, ordinances, resolutions that were passed after an improper executive session based on discussions therein could be invalidated, things like that. One point back to this is all under open meetings because executive session is the exception to the open meetings requirement. I got a lot of questions about, the prearranged meeting, going to dinner, going to a bar. People have, public officials have tried to get creative to get around the Open Meetings Act, and I would just recommend against trying to get cute with it. There's a infamous example, the city of Cincinnati. Actually, this was for when they were building, what were they building? One of the stadiums. Oh, the FC Cincinnati Stadium. And it was sort of a controversial topic in terms of location, financing, and whatnot. So council wanted to have some discussion in private, but they wanted everyone on the same page. So one council member would call council member A, talk about something, hang up, call council member B, talk about the same thing, hang up, call council member C, talk about the same thing, hang up, so on and so forth. That was a violation of the Open Meetings Act. City got hit for 6 figures, and is now used as an example every time I do this presentation. So I think that's probably worse than the 6-figure monetary violation. So, again, the way the Ohio sunshine laws are set up, you just err on the side of open and transparent government, is how I like to think about it. If there's ever a question, please call me, but I'd always err on the side of, if this is public, it needs to be done in the correct forum. Now, I say all that, that's not to say you can't discuss things with each other, with constituents, with me. I mean, obviously that stuff happens and needs to happen, but formal action and larger public discourse should happen in a formal open meeting. Perfect. Another really good point, Marvin. You're back to zero. I struck the negative points away from you. Yeah. So anything that you discuss in executive, there cannot be any votes. There cannot be any formal action in executive session. There can't even be a straw poll. You can't say, hey, hypothetically, if this motion is brought to your attention, just raise your hand if you think you'll vote for it. You shouldn't be doing that. Discussion generally is good, but ultimately all formal acts should be done in the public meeting when you exit out of executive session. Yeah. Great segue into public records and what is a public record and what is not a public record. So any record, which is defined as document, whether hard copy or electronic, emails, text messages, handwritten letters that are maintained for public business, becomes a public record. That means if you conduct public business or have public discussions on your personal email or phone, just because it's a personal computer or phone does not mean it's protected. It is a public record. Personal notes, to Marvin's point, can sometimes be considered records, and other times can be considered transitory such that they're not public records. So if you take your own personal notes at a council meeting, during executive session, at other public meetings, and you're keeping those notes for your own personal benefit, for recollection purposes, and they're not accessible to others or don't become part of a public database or public document system, those are not public records. Those are personal notes but just about everything else becomes a public record. So when an application is filed, I see this a lot. Developers, landowners, folks that want to do business with the village, want to submit an application with plans, or want to submit some drawings for sort of staff feedback or P&Z feedback or council feedback, but want to keep everything proprietary and don't want you to share it with anyone. The answer is we can't do that. The second it becomes part of the public domain, it becomes a public record. Now, typically how we handle those situations is there are exceptions, right? So there's still the attorney-client privileged. If I am providing legal advice or you are soliciting legal advice from me and I write an email or I write a memo, that's protected, right? It's a record and it's a public record, but there's an exception. That's the attorney-client privilege. You'll notice on any email of substance that I write to a public body, I typically denote that in bold, just to make it easier. If there is a public records request, we can easily identify those. In litigation, if there's work product, that's not a public record. There's an exception for proprietary information, but we, the city, does not get to decide whether, Joe Smith Corporation LLC that's building a plant here, whether their records are proprietary or not. So what we do is we agree to some sort of notification process where if there's a public records request to the city that asks for your plans, we agree to notify you within 24 hours, and you have to come in and defend the proprietary nature of those. So, but at the end of the day, anything that becomes part of the city's records are public record. Yeah, so because I am not a public employee, and because that is work product, there are a number of reasons that would not be considered. That would not be considered a public record. Yeah, there are ways to not make a public record, certainly, that are legal. So there's nothing really interesting about public records. It's talking about public and it's documented somewhere. Voice messages, if you chiseled something into stone, I mean, whatever medium it is, it's a public record. So that's pretty boring. Any questions so far? We're just about done. It's not too bad. All right, cool. Ethics was the last thing. The biggest thing is conflict of interest and using your position of authority to obtain something of value, right? So I get to wine and dine my private clients, but I unfortunately cannot do that with public officials and employees. I want to so badly, but I cannot because I have a contract with the city. And so I cannot be giving any of you who are potentially deciding whether my company receives money or not something of value. That is seen as a conflict of interest, and vice versa, right? So this comes up a lot with, again, I go back to any applicant for anything that the city's considering. They may want to talk to you all, what I call ex parte, outside of the formal proceedings. They may want to talk to council. They want to talk to design review board. May say, hey, I got Bengals Super Bowl tickets. Face value is only $50, not so bad. You shouldn't be accepting anything of value from anyone, really anyone, but particularly anyone doing business in before the city. Similarly, there could very well be individuals or companies or entities that come before any of you all with a legitimate application, but you or your family member happen to have either a financial interest in the company or awarding that contract to that company somehow benefits you financially. That's a very simple recusal. You would recuse yourself from consideration. You would leave the dais. Best practices says you would leave the room because courts have interpreted nonverbal cues to the remainder of the public body as improper, and you would abstain from voting and discussing it. So, at the end of the day, don't use your position of authority to gain anything of value. I'll give you another really good example of this that I now tell people of, also with the city of Cincinnati. And interestingly enough, this one involves my law firm, but in a good way, kind of, not in a bad way. So one of my law partners was representing an applicant for a development that needed to be approved by the city of Cincinnati. And it was controversial, it was a little contentious, and a city council woman, this is all public, so I'm not telling you anything private, city councilwoman approached my law partner and offered her vote of confidence in exchange for $10,000. Not smart. Yeah. Not smart. I think it was 10,000. Yeah. You can Google it. My partner immediately reported this, and the FBI caught this woman, and she's now in prison. So don't do that, especially to me, because I have obligations too.
You also can't go in an online poker room and bet a lot and then fold.
What's that?
Oh, that's one of them.
Is that like a money laundering operation or something?
They were taking contributions somehow.
Oh.
Poker room, and then somebody would bet like $10,000 and then fold, and then the other guy would take it.
Interesting. I hadn't heard of that one. That's a good one. Also not a great idea. Yeah.
Well, they got away with it for years, but hard to follow.
Yeah. I know this is going to be devastating to hear, but I've come to the end of my presentation. Yeah. We can stay longer. Yes.
So, last year, I had made a big push for everybody that worked for the city of Johnstown and the council to do the Ohio ethics training, which I think was just about an hour-long course.
Yeah.
I think to stay concise on that, those that are new to committees and new to council, if you are, maybe we ought to look at that again.
Absolutely. Well, I think there's a requirement every couple of years. Yeah.
Yeah, it is. I mean, you know my background with the city
Yep.
of Columbus, and those of you who don't know that, but I've been there 27 years, and I'm required to do that every year.
Yep.
It's a 1-hour course, refresher. Really goes in a little more in depth than what Yaz said, but it'll really open your eyes
Yeah.
to what you can and can't do.
Yep.
So I was pretty stringent about it.
Yeah.
But I think, I think now that we are, even when we were at the village status, now that we're at the city status, we want to set that example. We want to let people know that, we are at a certain level and we're not going to be compromised from there on out.
Yeah. No, that's a really good point, and I wholeheartedly agree. And my overview of the ethics laws was very high level, because Doug's right. I mean, there's so many little nuances that, frankly, sometimes you may do things or that you don't even think could be a problem, but they are. So.
I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Yaz, but you hit a good point with Super Bowl tickets.
Yeah.
Okay? If Intel or any developer would come in here and they bring a box of Cheryl's cookies, we throw them out. They're for everybody to enjoy. We can do that. If they approach Charlie and say, "Hey, I got 2 Super Bowl tickets on the 50-yard line," I'm going that.
He's resigning, then going. Yeah.
And when somebody finds that out, Charlie,
Yeah.
is he joining the lady in Cincinnati?
Yeah.
I mean, that's just how it is.
Yeah.
Because that's above,
The de minimis.
The minimus amount is I think they set it at like $50 or $75
Yeah.
or below
Yeah.
per gift, and that ticket is going to be probably
Yeah.
$1,000, $1,500 per seat.
Yeah.
And
It-
so they really touch on that.
Sure.
They really let you know like where your limits are and what
Yeah.
you can and really shouldn't do.
Correct. Yeah.
I've always informed the staff that works underneath me, don't do anything.
Yeah.
Don't accept anything, don't go out to lunch with anybody, don't accept tickets, don't get caught in a room one-on-one with somebody. It doesn't
Yeah.
work with the city.
Yeah, like I have to, oh, yes, Marvin, go ahead.
Does Ryan have to take the course twice since he's on council and zoning?
3 times, and for his last,
That answers my
yeah,
question.
yeah.
But I don't know, Teresa, did you set that up for everybody?
The ethics training?
Yeah.
Yeah,
You guys?
yeah, well, Dana sent it out.
Okay.
I
wonder if we-
think everybody on council
Every-
needs to take it again, too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's helpful, it's,
I think all staff got through it.
Okay, I wonder if we go through now that we've done this training, I
With
wonder
the
if
new
we send
people?
out to all of the committees.
Yeah, I
all
made
of
myself a
council,
note.
And we'll just do it and be done, and maybe that's something that we, I'm sorry, Chip, that we do around this same time every year,
Yeah.
after committees are formed and after the elections are over and everybody's sworn in. Yeah, it's sometime in February, right?
I am
If-
also, just real quick, I'm sending you all an email to the links. There is a March training on sunshine law, so I'm gonna send the link. It's a virtual training.
is it from the AG's office or? OML?
Yeah,
Oh,
it is,
AG's
the
office.
Ohio Attorney General, yeah. They do free trainings that I go on all the time. So there's one in March, but I'll send the link to all of you in case you wanna tune in. It's a little more detailed.
It is.
And then the, sunshine law manual,
Very helpful.
so I'll email those
Yeah.
to all.
There's a manual that's updated periodically that, frankly, that's my first stop when I'm reviewing nuanced issues. But, the last thing I will say is if there's any question in your mind, any of the stuff we just talked about, but ethics in particular, public records, open meetings, please call me. It's a lot easier for me to be able to understand what's going on and review something and make sure I give you the right answer, rather than walking into a meeting and having 10 seconds to figure out whether you just committed a first-degree misdemeanor or not. So, I would encourage that. Yeah, you're fine. Well, someone will call you if it's a problem. Yeah.
If I'm not here Saturday, don't worry about me. I mean,
Yeah, you got that. Yeah.
So if he takes the tickets and then just immediately resigns, he's still good, right?
I mean, here's the thing. Off the top of my head, I'd say probably, but I've read some of these ethics laws and considered some situations, and sometimes the Ohio Ethics Commission, who gets the ultimate decision-making authority, doesn't agree with what I think. So,
If Charlie would take the tickets and the retail price of the tickets and divide that by 5 and give each one, I'm part of it.
yeah, I mean, that'd be de minimis, I suppose.
I know they had this problem at Buckeye Lake. Say if Cheryl's got a real bad cold and I bring her some medicine. And they had that problem at Buckeye Lake and somebody sees me.
Really? Well, no, you guys are both council members. That's okay.
It's only 2 people.
It was liquor, I think, wasn't it?
Wait, what?
Yeah, I don't know if there, yeah. I don't know if that's an official ethics rule, but don't drink at the meetings. Oh, you can bring medicine and just don't drink liquor at the meetings. Yeah. Or before, again, probably it falls under best practices. Not sure if it falls under any like specific opinion, but. Yeah, no, let's save that for personal fun.
Yeah. I will add one more thing. Since you all have city emails through your board and the zoning board and council, obviously, if you ever do receive a public records request, you can forward it to me.
Yeah. Good point, Teresa, yeah.
So, FYI.
Let me consult my notes, see if we can extend this longer. I mean, there's a lot more to all of this, but I just wanted to give an abbreviated, high-level review to pique your interest just enough to ask me questions in the future. But I'm done otherwise. So thank you for listening to me for a little over an hour. And you all tied for first place, and Marvin got last place. So sorry, Marvin.
Yeah, who haven't voted on your contract?
Oh, that's good.
We did renew it.
It's like It's like golf. The lowest score wins. I got a treat in my car. It's de minimis.
I like that.
It's
It's not Super Bowl.
Thank you, Yaz.
oh, thank you for having me.
Appreciate it. Thanks, everybody, for coming tonight and spending your time. I think it's been well worth it. Appreciate planning and zoning furnishing us the time to do this for everybody. And we'll be a better city because of it and because of all of your service. So thank you very much.
Perfect. I think you guys got a couple more things on the agenda.
Is it good, bad, happening?
I see that you had your nice note on there that says, with the Intel announcement, there have been many phone calls.
That's an understatement.
So, people are
Can't
interested.
understand why.
And I bet some of those might be people asking questions about their property.
Yeah, I've even had local residents wanted to know if they could rent out their, they wanted to do a bed and breakfast. I have one.
See, we're ahead of this.
I have one guy that wants to turn his rental house into an office. I mean,
Turn your garage into accessory dwelling unit.
yeah. So we're getting a lot of questions.
Laugh. We spent like 2 months on that last year.
I've to touch on that. I've been in touch with a couple of folks at the city to render my assistance for anything that may come out of this development. So we'll be busy.
Storage units out there just put in an application, they want to change that to a red roof.
I think it already has a red roof. And they just rent the rooms out.
You're right.
We got that on Jersey.
But other than that, usually during January and February, you get a lot of new building permits for single-family homes, and we're right on track for that. Although we're probably going to run out of lots before the end of the year for sure. So that's something that we're being faced with. So.
We're under 50 lots probably left, right?
I think probably, Ryan, I need to do, I permitted 13 houses so far this year. And I'd say we're probably in we always forget about the neo-traditional lots.
That's true.
If you add those in, we're in the 80s, I'd say. And Pulte did have some restrictions on how many new homes they could sell per month. But I think they've reduced or increased the amount that they could sell. I'm going to find out tomorrow.
Other business? Motion to adjourn?
I'll second.
All in favor?
Where was he at? You were quick on the other one.
Yes, thanks for keeping it interesting.
No, thanks for having me.
I'm glad you came. That was great.
Yeah.
Let me stop that streaming before I get started.
Sure.
No, we're all going to go get drunk.
Talk about business.
Yeah.